So how many people have visited a national park here in the past, say, year? Wow. That's amazing. You're in good company. That's why. Well, you have lots of friends as well, because the National Park Service has, over the past year, had 421 million visits. Now, that's almost twice the population of the United States. So you can see how, how popular it is. There are 389 or 390 designated sites, depending on whether or not one gets ratified. And those are spread across the entire nation, as you know. Americans clearly have a love affair with their wild places. As many of us live in cities and only see animals on TV or in museums or zoos or aquaria like us here, or perhaps digging through their trash, they kind of maybe want to have a little more of a genuine experience. So our parks allow us to explore as diverse an array of environments imaginable and really encounter the flora and fauna on their own turf. But our national parks aren't just wilderness sites. They're recreation areas, harbor islands, cultural and historic sites. So you probably know more parks than you think. This evening we have the very great pleasure of welcoming a speaker who's both a research scientist and an eloquent spokesperson for the National Park Service. Dr. Gillian Bowser is currently the Gulf Coast Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit Liaison at Texas A&M University, but she's been involved in numerous research projects. She was an ecologist at Joshua Tree National Park. She was a wildlife biologist at Yellowstone. She was Assistant Chief of Resources at Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. And in addition, Dr. Bowser has served as the Special Assistant to the Director of the National Park Service and has helped to create Old Stories, New Voices Intercultural Youth Camp in Fort Garland, Colorado. Now, the theme that seems to have run throughout her career is one of tracking the biodiversity within various parks, from tortoises to bison to everything in between and smaller and larger. Learning about these park resources, but also really advocating to all of us why we should learn about our parks and treat them as a part of our own heritage, because they are. So without further delay, please help me welcome Dr. Gillian Bowser.
Thank you. I assume this thing, can everyone hear me okay? I guess it just switches on automatically. Well, thank you for coming out. Since I'm from Texas, I can say howdy, y'all. But I've only been in Texas for a couple of months. I hope we see this more as a dialogue than a lecture. What I want to share with you is not just the love of national parks, but I think why parks are important, why they're important for all of us, regardless to your background, and hopefully on one correction to Carolyn, that parks are more than wild places, they're more than wild animals. They're an incredible, diverse variety that represents our nation's heritage and our nation's character. It was neat, I came in yesterday with many delays to get here, but when I got to the hotel, they had this wonderful quote on my pillow, which was just so appropriate that I wanted to read it off to you. The quote is that, "There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem a parallel in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream." And that's William Wordsworth. I thought, to me, that embodies the spirit of the national park. I want to spend a second to sort of acknowledge the people who got me personally interested in national parks. I'm actually from Brooklyn, New York. Our biggest park is Prospect Park, though we now have Gateway. I think what's important is that people reach out to share what they see as a love of the national parks and pass that on to the next generation. James Court was a gentleman I met in Yellowstone National Park who got me my first job. J.T. Reynolds is probably one of the few African Americans in the National Park Service who serves as a senior superintendent. And then, of course, my favorite is Mr. Robert Stanton, who is the former director of the National Park Service. So I just wanted to make a moment to acknowledge those folks. So let's talk about what is a national park. And I hope we see this more as a dialogue than a lecture. But what is a park? And why is a park a park? What makes it something important for us as a nation to set aside? There are two ways to put this, and I'm going to give you guys a quiz. So take a moment and think of it. And it's a little bit of a trick. How many national parks, and I highlight the word parks, how many national parks are in the U.S.? You don't have to call it an answer. You can just think about it for a second. How many national parks are in the U.S.? And it's not 390. No giving away the answers. You can cheat later. Here's another trick question. Which national park is the oldest? You're all wrong. That's an interesting point. Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I didn't do it in geologic time versus regular time. Oldest in terms of the concept of an area being set aside purely for, and this is where you need to be careful, the enjoyment of the people. That is a key element in national parks. It's set aside for the enjoyment of people. Okay, let's look at another question. I'm going to throw some cultural heritage in because I think it's important that we look at parks as holistic of all the peoples of the United States, regardless as to what continent they came from, what language they originally spoke, or how they got here. So what was the heritage, cultural heritage, of the first superintendents of Yosemite National Park? I'll give you a hint, is that they wore a uniform. They wore a uniform. And my friend David Lowe here cannot give the answers. Oh, you don't know that one. Okay, another thing to think of, national parks, is said to start with, are our nation's heritage. They set aside the treasures that we see as being part or important for the United States. Okay? So, if that's the case, how many parks were set aside for African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans? How many parks are set aside for terrorism? For wars or for peace? It's an interesting way to think of for a second. And then who runs the national monuments? Who runs the national monuments? So let's just keep those in the back of our mind, and hopefully as we go through the talk, and you can scribble down your answer and check your answer later when we get to the end. But it's important because I think one of the key components of the success of the national park is understanding how a park becomes a park, and how do we actually preserve it in perpetuity. So how is a park? You have to pardon my bad English here. A park is proposed by a piece of legislation. So we have a class in park management at Texas A&M, and their wildlife majors will come up and they say, you know, I hate politics, and I want to work outdoors, so I want to go into parks. Well, parks are proposed by legislation. It is all politics. Okay, they are created by government action. Okay, so you cannot create a national park as a citizen without an act of Congress. Okay, and it does take an act of Congress for a park to be created. There's one exception to the rule, and that is an executive order. And it's very rarely used, very rarely used. But there are some exemptions to that. Each park, every single park in the system has its own enabling legislation. And you might think, well, who cares? Well, why is that important? We tend to think of the parks as the family of the National Park Service. And I truly believe the National Park Service Organic Act, which I'll show you in a minute, is probably the most quoted piece of legislation that the U.S. ever wrote. Most people know that parks are set aside for the enjoyment of future generations. Almost everyone can say that. You see that in almost all the parks. But there's other pieces in there. So it's important to understand that every park has its own enabling legislation, and that enabling legislation will tell you why is that park a park. And that can be binders for the park managers, or it can be freedom. And that's an important thing to remember. Under the umbrella of the National Park Service, and the National Park Service Act and the National Park Act, 1916, 1872, that puts the unit as one of the system of parks. Okay, so it has its own enabling legislation, but it sits under the umbrella. And that gets back to that question as to who runs national monuments. Because until recently, actually several times in our history, national monuments have been all over the place. Okay, so let's move ahead a little further before my computer wakes up. Let's look at national parks as a concept. We tend to think of a wonderful story about a camping expedition out west, and they sat around the fire and said, boy, we really need to put this aside for everyone to get a chance to enjoy. Right? We think about the Hayden expedition that went to Yellowstone and started the motion for Yellowstone to be set aside. I think what's real interesting, I recently had the fortunate opportunity to go to China with a group of people from the National Park Service, and our mission was to talk about the concept of national parks to the Chinese government and say, how do you can set up your own parks? We went to a beautiful park called Duchayan in Sichuan province, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name, which is a gorgeous park with waterfalls and old irrigation systems and lots of wildlife. And we walk around this park and say, this is amazing. When was this established as a park? The gentleman turns to me and says, 452 BC. So it's important to think of national parks as a concept of setting aside a place or an idea for public use. And we tend to think of it as national parks as a title. If it's not a national park, is it still set aside for our use? And that's an important distinction. So if you go from the Caribou in Alaska to Duchayan, China, you have a whole realm of national parks and a whole realm of centuries and of culture and of peoples from Russia that went through the areas of Alaska all the way to the Chinese and the Chinese peoples. So national park is an incredible concept. As many of you may have heard, the World Park Congress just took place. And there, it's a concept that goes worldwide. It unites us, the idea that people have the right to treasure something of their lands. So what I want to do is put a little bit of a bandaging around when the national parks came into place and what the vision was that allowed parks to be set up, and then look at how that vision has changed a little bit. And I'm not a historian, so I will not attempt to use dates and times, but just give you a feel as to what was going on as national parks were set up, because that tells us why we see parks a particular way, which may be different than we see parks today and the current group of parks that are in the U.S. 1832, the first national park in the United States was Hot Springs Preserve, set aside by act of Congress, purely for use in Arkansas. That actually is the oldest unit in the system. Though, Yellowstone doesn't like giving away to Arkansas, but that's another idea. But it's very interesting because that act was set aside a long time before Yellowstone. You think of the gap of time from 1832 and show you some of the events that took place. The fact that that idea stayed and bubbled along through a tumultuous time in the U.S. to get to the Yellowstone Act is really amazing. Right after that park was founded, we have the U.S.-Mexican War. We then move into a whole industry of whaling. I'll talk a little bit more about why I mentioned whaling. And we're exploring the Arctic. We're exploring new places. People are moving around. And then we hit the Civil War. Then right after the Civil War, actually almost in the middle of it, an incredible book is written about the origin of species and the concept of species as entities. And you think about all this going on, and we're starting to set aside areas specifically as parks, specifically in our current view of parks, but was that true at the time? Whales, gold, and slaves. I like to think about that as a sort of context that's going on as parks set aside. It's an interesting picture. Many of you are probably familiar with New Bedford whaling, because it's fairly close to here. Fascinating story of people escaping from the South and slaves, getting on boats at New Bedford, and ending up in Alaska. So you look at the New Bedford whaling that took them to Inuit heritage area in Alaska. You look at the same time, you've got things like the California gold rush going on, the Klondike gold rush going on, and in the midst of all this, you have something called the contraband camps. Camps set aside for freed slaves across Union lines during the Civil War. So people are moving, things are changing. We have new horizons, new frontiers, right? We're exploring the Arctic. On top of it, at the same time, you have the fur trade moving, and I'm mixing my time a little here. And the reason why I want to do that is because the fur trade changed our perception of animal populations in many ways. And the reason why you see that is because for a while the U.S. had this idea, this boundless continent, boundless area. And in that boundless area, you had unlimited resources. You could hunt and trap forever. And in around the same time, now we're bubbling around the Park Service Act, and we're getting between the parks, Yellowstone being set up, National Park Service not yet there, we passed what's called the Antiquities Act, 1906. What does that Antiquities Act do? It gives the president the power to set aside something as important. And one president is particularly famous for setting up 19 national forests in one night with that very act, and that was Theodore Roosevelt. But the first treaty on the feather trade was right around the same time. If you remember, many bird populations started crashing around that time because plumage was big in hats, and birds were disappearing. And suddenly we started to get recognition things are not boundless. We're exploring like crazy, but things maybe have a boundary, and maybe we need to protect those populations. Oops, I got 2 in that. Beaver population collapses, and the World Fair in St. Louis features exotic peoples, exotic animals as something to come see, explore. These are things that we need to set aside as vignettes for the American public. Lastly, at the same time, we're looking at the Landscape School of Art. Huge canvases, complete with curtains, are being displayed around the world about this magnificent American West and the scenery contained therein. Black and white photography is moving in. And you have these landscape paintings as a way to make the American public connect to the parks. And those were an important piece of advertisement. Now I'm looking at the time frame right after Yellowstone has been explored. The Yellowstone Act has passed. We do not have a National Park Service, but we have this idea of grandeur in the West. Grandeur in the West that we should all be interested in. We should all go to. We should all explore. And hopefully you'll take a railroad to get there, because the railroads were critical in setting up the initial national parks. I believe cars were not allowed in Yellowstone until the 1920s. It was only by railroad access for a long time. Okay. And then lastly, I think most importantly, we have the Arctic exploration and the discovery of new species, new ideals, new limits to our exploration. And this whole time we're going into the Arctic coast and the ice and then the sinking of the Titanic. So what makes a park a park? Now remember, we started with the Yellowstone Act in 1872 that set up aside a park that was specific for thermal features. The thermal wonders of Yellowstone were to be a pleasuring ground for the American tourist. It was seen as something, the vacation of style to do. Take a nice railroad car there, stay at a very nice hotel, and explore the geologic wonders of Yellowstone. And the first act of Yellowstone very much reflects that. There was a place to be seen, to be visited. But what makes a park that important? Let's back up for a second and get to where we are today to see how parks have changed from that vision and when the Park Service as an agency first comes on the scene. Again, remember I said it's proposed by a piece of legislation. It's created by government action. It has to have a fundamental purpose, and that's in that enabling legislation. Why is that park there? And we started through the 1900s. Remember, we just came out of the Civil War. We have all these old battlefields that are very painful for people. Initially, the War Department had all these monuments that they wanted to set aside in perpetuity to celebrate battles of different types throughout the war. As these are starting to build, we now have about 35 units coming to 1912, right in the middle of World War I, that are now being managed under many different agencies, and many of them are managed by the military. So there starts to be a movement to say that we need to have a central agency because every park should have a fundamental purpose that we will manage it by to preserve its story and to preserve its past. Serve to represent the national character. At this point, the U.S. was still a little bit isolationist, and we were trying to figure out who we are, and we're protecting the view of what America is. And now we need to get an agency together that says these will be protected for the enjoyment of populations throughout in perpetuity. Now remember, we've got the war going on at the same time, so there's a lot of pressure on the acting superintendents for timber cutting, a lot of pressure to use those resources as part of the war effort. So at the same time, the agency is trying to say, we've set aside Yellowstone, but now everybody wants timber out of it. We've set aside Yosemite, and now we have timber concerns. How do we set that park up? technically, just throw this in real quick, technically it's set up under what's called U.S. Code Title 16. Every park in the system is there. And that's the umbrella that became the National Park Service. It said each park will sit in a common unit in the U.S. Code. Every park in the system is listed there, this enabling legislation. And technically, because we sit under that umbrella, we are all regulated by 36 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. And let's just keep that in the background, because that's some boring legislative information. So let's look at the National Park Service Act. First introduced in 1910 and failed several times, was eventually passed in 1916. They created an agency, and very specifically, what I put in red was added in 1996. They created, 1992, I believe it is, an act that says there will be a department. Recently, they said the director will be appointed and approved by Congress, appointed by the president, approved by Congress. What does that do to parks? Think about that. It changes them as a political entity. In the past, they were not part of that. And the director shall have substantial experience in land management, natural and cultural preservation. Mesa Verde was one of the first parks to come into the system. Ooh, what's it doing? Stop that. Okay, so again, let's look at the National Park Service Act. It has three major components I'd like to highlight for a second. It establishes and promotes the use of federal areas. It brings together several different federal areas as national parks, monuments, and reservations. That's the first thing the Act does, is pull everything together under an envelope. Now remember, some of these parks were set up by the War Department, some of them were set up by industry that was interested in tourism, and some of them were bubbling along that were set up by states way back when. And Yosemite was first owned by the state. So all these parks are now being combined under a single agency. And that agency has a key mission. It needs to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner to leave them unimpaired for that future generation. That's an incredible charge. You need to actually set that area apart so that the future generations gets a chance to enjoy it. That means you need to manage it. You need to understand it. Lastly, there's a fair amount of things. You conserve the scenery, natural, historic, and objects therein, because every park has a fundamental purpose as to why it's set up. Fundamental purpose.
What year was it passed?
Sorry?
What year was it passed?
1916. 1916. So now we have this beautiful vision, right? And we all think parks were set aside, and they're now protected from timber industry. They're protected from logging. They're protected from livestock. But let's look at the second part of this act, which doesn't get quoted as much as the first part. This is Section 3. Lots of text. Don't worry about it. Woo! Read that fast. Three major elements in the establishment of the National Park Service system. It allows for the cutting of such timber. It allows for the destruction of such animals, and it allows the grazing of livestock. And I think this is one of the albatrosses around the Park Service's neck that led to the destruction of the wolf in most of the parks. It led to a lot of timber being removed from the older parks. But it's something we don't associate with the National Park Service history. Until fairly recent, until we get to one of the Omnibus Acts much later, that there was a lot of Park Service rangers removing unwanted animals. You know, if you look at Yellowstone, I believe the last wolf was removed in 1952. And then we spent all this money to put him back again. But you think, and in Badlands National Park, you can still shoot prairie dogs. Okay? So we allow for the destruction of such animal, and we allow for the grazing of livestock in the context of a national park. So let's go through some quick legal terms, because I really find it important that we all citizens, and as we are all stewards, understand where the parks come from. Where do they come from? How do they get there? They're set aside in 1916. It's certainly a start, and that was the establishment of the Park Service. But then we followed up with something called an executive order, which you hear about quite a bit, but we don't necessarily associate it with an act of Congress. An executive order can be passed by any president without the feedback of the general public. Okay? It's very different than something gets set aside by a bill that, under an act that we'll show you in a minute, requires public input. Okay? It goes into something called a public law, which you can find on the internet these days very easily if you want to search. And it goes into the U.S. Code. Now, why is that important? It's because it means that the parks are managed within this umbrella, again, of rules and regulations that says what needs to go on in that park. And we tend sometimes to not focus on that. Okay, so the question we need to go back and ask is, given all these laws and regulations, do the parks actually preserve our national heritage? Do they accomplish the idea they've set aside and they've gotten the wildlife preserved throughout the life of the park? This is one of my favorite animals, the digress section. This is a desert tortoise. I don't know if any of you have seen them. And this is a good symbol of a national park. We keep trying to push getting the bison off the arrowhead, but the desert tortoise hasn't made it yet. The animal lives for about 120 years. Very long-lived animal, very primitive animal, very slow animal. But isn't our mission about preservation for the long term, preservation for future generations? An animal that lives longer than us, it's our job to preserve it and its population. It's a great animal. It's really fun. But this is actually my specialty is bugs. Why do we not have a slime mold national park? And we all laugh, but think about it for a second. We talked about parks as being these wonderful landscapes. And today's buzzword is biodiversity, that we must preserve the biodiversity of the parks. We must preserve the biodiversity of the U.S. How come we don't name any parks after insects? Where does the biodiversity arrive? There's a wonderful quote by a biologist named H.S. Haldane when asked if he could tell the nature of the creator from his creations, and his response was, well, he had an inordinate fondness for beetles. But Slime Mold National Park, if we're looking at things that preserve the national character and have important, significant, and impact on the U.S. as a nation, what about DNA fingerprinting? What about DNA fingerprinting? And why is that at all related to parks? The organism, a thermophilic bacteria that creates a little protein called Taq polymerase, allows scientists to replicate DNA. So if that organism had not occurred in the Yellowstone hot springs, and that organism was discovered in Yellowstone and discovered to be able to maintain its DNA at high temperatures and replicate, the whole field of being able to fingerprint, identify individuals from a piece of hair, from a hairnail, a drop of blood, our whole criminal world would be very different than it is today. So why don't we call it Thermophilus Bacteria National Park? Because there's something of national significance, is it not? Yes, sir.
It's basically way too long and too hard to pronounce.
I like him. Good point. You call it Bug National Park. That would work. That would work. Slimo, that would probably shortened out to SLMO in our lingo. Slummo National Park.
Like people that are afraid of bugs don't know what it means.
But it's an educational point, and is the park about educating people about their diversity? Okay. So what are we setting up the park for? The other thing that we don't think of is we assume that the national parks are static entities, and that the wildlife within those parks never change. They never change their habits. They never adapt to us. They never decide to do something a little bit different than we would have expected. And that's an important problem when you think about how we manage parks and how we look at parks. What if the wildlife thinks that the suburban area is pretty okay? And we laugh, but look at the coyote populations across the U.S. Look at the white-tailed deer populations across the U.S. I always believe there's a message about parks and why parks are that we're missing by not looking at animals who do a very good job in suburbs. Very good job. This obviously is from Alaska, where moose are like squirrels up there. So let's look at a moment at how is the concept of national parks been supported by other legislation and put in the greater context of the U.S. as a whole, and get back to why are parks parks. Everyone probably is familiar with the Wilderness Act of 1964. And this act is interesting in many ways because we now tend to say, when we ask how many parks there are in the system, we tend to assume that every park in the system has wilderness character or has a potential for wilderness character. This came out of a review called the Leopold Report, where they talked about wilderness being someplace that has the outstanding opportunities for solitude or for primitive and unconfined type of recreation. Can you do that in Gateway National Park?
Is that Aldo Leopold, by any chance?
Yes, that's correct. We also said it generally appears to primarily be affected by the forces of nature and that the imprint of man is substantially unnoticed. The famous thing that still goes on, leave no trace, leave nothing behind but your footprints. How does that work in Gateway National Park? This computer is slow. We also took national parks and we defined them as wilderness characters. Now think back as to when the parks were founded. We're exploring the Arctic. We're looking at changes in the U.S., the Hudsonian landscapes. We still think of parks that way, this big, wonderful landscape that is dominated by some amazing feature, and man is reduced to a mere minuscule, unnoticed thing, untrammeled by man. What does untrammeled by man mean? And how in a park do you set that park up to be untrammeled by mankind? I'm not sure what that's doing. There we go. But the key thing under the Wilderness Act that is often overlooked is that it must be on existing federal land. Okay, so we've defined wilderness as only occurring on federal land. In 1970, an amazing act was passed called the NEPA Act, which stands for the National Environmental Policy Act, which says that each generation, and think back of the National Park Service Act, each generation is a trustee of the environment. It has safe, healthy, productive, cultural environment, beneficial uses of the environment, preserves important historical, cultural, it makes sure there's a balance. But what is it set up that's a piece of work that you probably hear about every day, and you probably see in the news almost every single day? It sets up the Environmental Impact Statement, the EIS. Without this piece of legislation, you would not require an EIS. Every federal action must follow NEPA. Even the Park Service must follow NEPA. An important environmental piece of legislation. Everything must consider an environment. Two quick additional acts that passed at the same time was one saying the National Park Service, now think of this for a second, we talked about the parks in this wilderness character, but it wasn't until 1970 that we said the parks must manage resources, that we were responsible for maintaining a natural balance of populations. That was not until the Redwood Act. And the National Park Service Omnibus Act then said, okay, manage all your populations, but by the way, everybody can recreate in the park at the same time. So you say we set up a dichotomy of how parks exist. Okay, and then lastly, we looked at how do parks change? How is land added to a national park? And that's important when you think of, again, the times of national ownership, private ownership. How do we expand the parks? In the last 5 years, we added 20 units to the National Park Service system. 20 units. Okay, so let's go back to our quiz. Everybody remember their quiz questions? Oh, God, everybody's falling asleep. Let's look at the answers for a second. How many national parks are there? Does anyone know? How many national parks are there? There are 57 national parks. Okay? So if you look at the National Park Service system, I'll tell you there are 21 different types of units in the National Park system. The vast majority of them are battlefields. Vast majority of them are battlefields. Vast majority of them are cultural sites. We have national battlefields, National Battlefield Park, National Military Parks, National Historic Parks, National Historic Sites, National Lakeshore, Seashore, Monument, Park. How many people have been to Washington, D.C. and driven down the George Washington Parkway? That is a national park. George Washington Parkway, Blue Ridge National Parkway, Natchez Trace Parkway. The idea of a scenic motorway was added to the National Park Service system in the 1960s. Okay, National Preserve, recreation areas. You get the point. There's a huge variety of things that we call national parks, yet only 57 are set up to be a natural area. The rest are set up to be a cultural, some other representative of our natural heritage or our nation's heritage. Second question you remember was which national park is the oldest? We already got that answer. What was one of the cultural heritage of some of the first superintendents of Yosemite? Right? Just remind you of the questions. How many parks were set aside for African Americans, for terrorism, for war, for peace? You don't think of that in terms of a concept of a national park, do we? And who runs national monuments? So let's look at some answers. And you can score yourself if you'd like. How many parks were set aside for terrorism? One of the earliest ones that some people think was a terrorist was John Brown at Harper's Ferry. The most recent one is not World Trade Center, but Flight 93. Okay? What's one that you should all be familiar with that's well established is Oklahoma City. It's a national monument. What about for wars?
How did Boston Harbor end up as a terrorism?
Well, a friend of mine actually stuck that in there. Thinking of the Harbor Tea Party. Whether you can trace that back to the Revolution. I'm glad somebody caught that. I thought, ooh, that's stretching it. Sand Creek Massacre. Is that not terrorism on our own people? Sand Creek Massacre. What about wars? I mean, Pearl Harbor is the obvious one. Why is Manzanar or Mendocca on there? I mean, a whole piece. We talked to the high school kids earlier today, and the children of Asian descent did not know what Manzanar was, did not know what Mendocca was. The fact that the United States had equivalent to concentration camps for people of Asian descent during World War II. Very important thing to know. That's our job of telling stories. African American Civil War Memorial. Civil War Memorial is in Washington, D.C. African American Civil War Memorial. How many parks were set up for cultural heritage? Okay, how do we recognize, again, going back to our national character, And one park I left out here is the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. Lower East Side Tenement Museum. Nez Perce, Frederick Douglass, Jean-Baptiste, Knife River, New Orleans Jazz. Carter Woodson is the newest unit coming in 2005. So now think of our concept of parks here, is how it's changed when we came from the Hudsonian school to a park like Central Little Rock High, or a park like Brown versus the Board of Education. And you think again of the context of what was going on between 1872 to 1916, and then look at today, with things like civil rights, we think is something we need to set aside to preserve. Where terrorism was probably a concept that we would not have thought about, that's something we want to set aside and remember as part of our nation's heritage. Very different view as to what changes and what becomes, and why should something be a national park. What was the cultural heritage of the first superintendents of Yosemite National Park? Does anyone know that one? Anyone know that one? They were related to a big group that was here, that was based out of Boston, 54th Cavalry.
No, the Buffalo Soldiers.
Buffalo Soldiers, 9th Cavalry, were the first superintendents, not the first, but one of the first groups of superintendents to run Yosemite National Park. Here's a piece of history that has disappeared, has gotten lost. Buffalo Soldiers running Yosemite. Which national park is the oldest? I'm not sure that Duchenne is the oldest, but it's up there. Hot Springs National Park. Royal Park in Australia was set aside at the same time. Now remember, Yosemite was first set aside. They claimed to be the oldest, but they first were at the state level. But the concept was there. So you could throw Yosemite in there. All of those well before Yellowstone. And yet we all associate Yellowstone as the oldest concept of what is a park. So I want to sort of close to remind us that national parks are really about preserving the United States character, who we are, and each park to do that has a fundamental purpose as why it's there. Flight 93 is set up for a fundamental purpose, to talk, to remember, to keep alive the heritage, if you call it heritage, of September 11th. But we are all stewards of that. It is for us to tell both the stories that are painful and the stories that are beautiful, and we forget to do that. We go to Fort Raleigh and we see a beautiful story about the lost colony, but we do not hear about the contraband camps that were in that same location. It's important for us to remember to tell those stories. And that's what parks are about, because they're telling our national character. It is our job to protect those parks. And I think it's important to think of the parks as beyond, a big place out west that starts with the letter Y that I might get to when I retire and I buy an RV. Because it could be a park right here. The African American Meeting House is right in downtown Boston. And this morning, we met with a group of high school students, and none of them knew it was there. Or a few of them knew it was there. There's our heritage. There's a story that we should be telling. Oh, by the way, I was just going to mention real quick. So a fun story. This is a desert tortoise who you may have noticed has additional gear on him. One of the challenges is, how do you tell what biodiversity exists in a park? How do you know that you've done a good job in protecting that park? That gets back to that slime mold national park. The greatest diversity in a park may not be what you see. It may not be what you see. I was at a meeting at Great Smokies just 2 days ago, and they estimate they have 65,000 species in that park. They're doing what's called an all-taxa biodiversity inventory. 2,300 species new to science in 4 years. So we are missing the boat in biodiversity. And like one gentleman said, is and wait till we start the nematodes. And that's why I had to throw my bug picture in here. The rich biological diversity, the next thermophilic bacteria, the next one who may have the cure for cancer. We hear that all the time for the tropical forests, but what about our own parks? What about our own parks? I mean, there are things that exist right under our nose. The horseshoe crabs at Cape Cod National Seashore are set aside or protected in that seashore for medicinal use. But I forgot which drug it goes for. I think it's a heart monitoring drug that they use the horseshoe crabs for. And so far, they've not been able to synthesize the drug. And again, that's important why the parks exist. A park like Golden Gate, they're for the urban environment, recreation, contemplation, relaxation, exaltation. Go to Gateway. I mean, go to Golden Gate. A park is part of who we are as a people. And I hope that didn't print off the top. It sure did. I apologize. See, understanding why a park is a park sometimes is more important than understanding what occurs in a park. You can go to the Alaska parks and think, wow, this park is here because it's got grizzly bears. But that's not why that park is there. This is from Katmai National Park, set up in Alaska. One of the primary pieces of information at Katmai National Park is not only Russian heritage, but some of the oldest Tlingit and Inuit heritage known. It occurred in a place called Kijik Village. Okay? We've forgotten some of that history. And I think I hopefully at least left you the message that a park is a contextual window. What we saw when the Park Service was first founded, when the Yellowstone idea was first founded, is very different than what founds a park today and what the newest parks are today. Carter Woodson Home is currently an abandoned building in downtown D.C. Is that appropriate as a National Park Service unit? In today's unit, it is. In the context of the original National Park Service, it may not have been considered as appropriate. So a park exists within the context of its time. So finally, how does a park become a park? It has national significance. I use the term resource evaluation. You need to know what's there. You need to know who's there. We should have some idea whether it should be Slime Mold National Park or Bug National Park. You need to have some way to say that the park can be protected. I mean, unfortunately, in today's world, it must have a boundary. You need to know where that boundary is. And I would love to see the day that we have virtual parks. I would love to see a day we have virtual parks, but not yet. I threw in another thing called management options. Every park has stakeholders, and we must not forget the stakeholders. If you look back at the act of NEPA, something that we all forget to do is to check to see who our representatives are, right? What committees they serve on, and whether the Federal Register has a notice about the park in our neighborhood. That's what NEPA is all about. It says that every action has public comment. Every action has public input. So it's part of you being a steward to the park that you can find out what's going on in the parks in your area. Is there a Federal Register notice? Is there an act going on that affects my neighborhood? You know, Boston Harbor Parks just recently completed their management plan. A very important act that affects how everyone in the city of Boston uses that park. And lastly, and most importantly, is yourself. You are part of the National Park Service system, and the parks are set up for you. And I hope I can at least pass some of the passion on why I think parks are so important. They're for everyone, they're everyone's heritage, and that we should never let them go away. I think that's my last little thought from the grizzly bear. So thank you so much for your time. I believe we have time for some questions. Yes, sir.
Virtual parks. You just kind of sort of said you'd love to see it and then sort of dismissed it in a sense. We already have some in a sense, but they're not established at the national scale. For instance, in the Boston area, there are many sites that are related to engineering achievements and things like that have been lumped together under something that is called the Innovation Trail. And you can both navigate it on the web, anybody can do it from anywhere, or you can actually come to the museum and catch a bus that will take you around to the different sites. They're distributed all around Boston and Cambridge, and they encompass medical, financial, telecommunications, and a number of other ones. And there's clearly hundreds more of these all over the rest of the country that are right now just a random spot that nobody has really thought about whether it was significant. But 25 or 30 years from now, if it disappears or whatever, we may say, well, gee, why didn't we have that place where Wozniak and Jobs created the Apple or something like that or whatever. I don't know if that's been preserved or not. Probably has because they're rich, but they preserved it for themselves. I know that they did preserve the garage that Hewlett and Packard started from. But there's going to be hundreds more of these kinds of things that many people are never going to be able to visit personally, but they could be visited on the web, for instance, and that might make their preservation easier if people could access it.
Oh, I definitely agree, and I didn't mean to belittle the virtual parks. Underground Railroad is a good example of that. It's a beautiful brochure of trails, and the idea is that you can follow the railroad path, but it's a virtual park. And it's the only one we have. And I see the National Park Service system as pulling that as a unit. Well, the Lewis and Clark Trail would be a second example. That's such a critical resource because it does allow you to see the connection among sites. I think it's important that you look at not just the individual story, but how it fits in a context. So you shouldn't just go to Selma to Montgomery Trail and not understand where Martin Luther King's site might fit in, or the Tuskegee Airmen. Or you shouldn't go to Harper's Ferry and miss those pieces that were going on at the same era. And that's the problem. I think we tell it as a fragmented story rather than as a trail. And that's what a virtual park would do a beautiful job at.
Obviously, we have in Boston, again, the Freedom Trail,
right,
which ties together a number of sites that are in the Boston National Historic Park. But there are other related sites that could be linked better, for instance, like Lexington and Concord and Minuteman National Historic Park could be linked on the web to the Boston National Historic Park. It's not.
Yes. Great point. I guess this young gentleman had his hand up. Quick.
You said like the Lewis and Clark Trail thing. Do you know if there's like a website or something?
Yes, there's an excellent website on the Lewis and Clark.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think she wants it for the mic, correct?
It's for the folks in the overflow. Yeah.
So the question was on for the Lewis and Clark Trail.
Is there like a website or something?
There is an excellent website for the Lewis and Clark Trail that is called the Corps of Discovery 2. And what the Park Service is doing is recreating the Lewis and Clark Trail. They actually have a semi-truck instead of horseback that has a traveling exhibit that's following the Lewis and Clark Trail. I believe it should be in Astoria, Oregon, right on the anniversary of the Lewis and Clark's overwintering.
So what's the website?
www.nps.gov, and then you search under, you'll say choose your park, and it'll say Lewis and Clark.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I have a question, but on this question, there may still be available at the New York Times website a series that was done, a feature series that was done about the Lewis and Clark expedition. That might also be of some interest.
Right. So the comment was that a New York Times article on the Lewis and Clark may still be
a feature series.
Oh, okay.
Several lengthy articles, including some wonderful pictures. My question is, I wonder if you could talk a little about the problems, as you understand them, that are people would argue are being experienced or are taking place in our national parks, whether it's issues involving logging or mining or the ones that you alluded to, or other issues, and I'm particularly interested in when I saw the McDonald's. Well, I gather that's a concessions restaurant in one of the national parks. I'm interested in how decisions are made, how are decisions about what kinds of concessions, uses that include that kind of thing, how those decisions are made. I would much rather see a lodge run by independent, restaurateurs than the corporatization of our national parks. So within the general question, I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about that more specific
Because, as I understand, the question was on concessions in the national park and how the decision is made to have different concession operators in the park. The one correction is, no, the McDonald's picture was not inside a national park. I was more interested in the moose in that picture. Again, it gets back to, and that's a really interesting question and a very in-depth question. It gets back to that fundamental purpose of a national park. When the Omnibus Act was passed that brought in Gateway and Golden Gate National Parks, national recreation areas, as part of units of the National Park Service system, it was a real fundamental shift on how we view parks. And I think that's important to start to think in the general context. Remember, we have this umbrella that's the National Park Service system, and that each park has its fundamental purpose. What happened at that point, and that's when the Park Service also began to expand in terms of the number of units. We went very quickly from about 180 units to where we are now. We're very close to 400 units in the system. And actually, as the Interior Agency, we have one of the highest number of bills introduced every day into Congress relating to parks, park proposals, the areas that should be considered in the park. What happens, the fundamental shift says that national parks are areas of national character, whether it's a school in central Little Rock, whether it's actually a building in Topeka, Kansas for Brown versus Board of Education. And then under that umbrella, we need to decide what is appropriate given the park's fundamental purpose. So look at Boston Harbor Parks, for example. That park is primarily set up for recreation, which is a good thing for the peoples of Boston. It is not within the charter of the park to close all the islands for nesting birds, even though that might be good for the bird population. This is this balance, this horn of dilemma that the Park Service sits on all the time, and that gives the Park Service strength, that you need to know how to balance all your stakeholders and keep them all engaged. But I personally strongly believe that the biggest danger to the national park is becoming irrelevant. That we have a society that has complete more and more electronic uses and fewer people seeing the need to explore those national parks, to understand why that park is a park and why that heritage is important to them as an American, or what stories a park is telling. That's a bigger challenge. Where will we be in 20 years? Will we still get support from Congress? Are we still relevant to the changing American population? That's a huge challenge, regardless to what we do. But I see how we tell those stories, regardless of the story. Whether it's a painful one, about lynching in the U.S., or it's a beautiful one about John Muir or Eugene O'Neill. Our job should be to tell that story as best as possible so people understand why the concession is okay in Gateway and is not okay in Wrangell St. Elias. And I think that's an important battle for us to take on as an agency, which requires a lot more flexibility than agencies are known for.
Are you at all concerned about the first part of the question? Are you concerned that there may be too much mining, logging, and grazing taking place, or that it's not being managed properly?
No, I'm concerned the American public is not as engaged with parks as a whole. The whole system of parks, every park that's in that system, it should be relevant to everybody. You see a huge increase in the Hispanic population. We have very few parks that tell their story. Is that important to Hispanic people? We should be asking that question. We have very few parks, and one of the recent struggles with the Civil War parks was very few parks tell the story of the Civil War in terms of slavery. But that's important to the African American people. Do we become irrelevant to those people? That to me is a danger far beyond logging or mines, because it affects all 380 units. Mining may affect 10 units, 15 units, but there are 380 of us, 390 of us that need to be protected and preserved for our kids and the next generation. You should know what a contraband camp is in 20 years. You should know who the Buffalo Soldiers are in 20 years. You should know Mendoza. Every child should know that, that the idea of the United States itself and its own citizens in arms has happened on our soil. And that to me is a critical need, and the Park Service should tell those stories.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think I know the answer to the first part of the question. With the rapid expansion of the National Park Service units, has there been an equivalent expansion of funding for those units? And then vis-a-vis the relevancy issue, do you know whether visitorship to the parks has gone up or down, or what the trend line is of visitorship to the various units?
So the first question was on funding, whether with the increase in Park Service units, has the funding also increased? And the second one was on visitorship. Both of them, are, as you know, are kind of thorny. Obviously, I don't think our funding has kept pace with the number of units. And one of the dangers that we run into is the excitement of setting apart a unit, but not the funding to support the unit. And Mojave Desert is a very famous example of that. As you know, it's set up with a budget of $1. So there's a danger there. You want to get a park set up, you want to get it moving. You have a strong constituent that believes that park needs to be here. There was another park in Pennsylvania, the steam locomotives, that turned out to be a nightmare to manage because the Park Service did not have the funds to maintain it. And that, unfortunately, falls in our history a lot. So there's no easy answer there. But I do believe that the U.S. Park Service is one of the best-loved agencies in the U.S. It's amazing how many people love the idea of park rangers. So we're not translating that to a political force because we tend to get tangled on issues that don't affect the umbrella of the park. Because it's hard for us to get our fingers around a park that might be half an acre in downtown D.C. to 13.2 million acres in Alaska. I mean, it's really hard to get the public's fingers around what is the National Park Service and how do we keep this agency alive and how do we keep this idea alive. It's like biodiversity. You can't get public excited about Slimewall National Park because there are 1,100,000 of these little guys. And you need a microscope to see them. But that may be the key to saving the Smokies. But boy, it's hard to sell it. The second question, again, was on...
I'm just wondering if visitorship... as the
on visitorship, thank you.
If visitorship has expanded in parallel or what the trends line.
The off-the-record answer or the official National Park Service answer? The off-the-record answer is, unfortunately, the agency is catching up with statistical science. So, for example, first of all, two things. Number one, many parks do not have entrance counters. Right, so how do you count how many people come into a national park? Number two, you have parks like Blue Ridge, George Washington Parkway. So do you count every commuter as a visitor to that park? Pigeon Forge, right? Mm-hmm. Pigeon Forge, that's the most visited unit of the Park Service system. 13 some odd million visitors. How many of those guys are just driving through? So visitation is very thorny to answer. How many people experience the national park experience? Do you count them in a visitor center? What if you don't have a visitor center? Many of the parks do not. So a very hard question to answer. A very hard one to answer. But it's interesting. If you go back and look at, if you really need to fall asleep at night, is pull up what's called the Green Book, which is the federal budget. It's actually very interesting to look. Sometimes you should look at the federal budget. If you've never looked, it's fascinating what goes in there. But anyway, the federal budget puts a base amount on every park based on visitation. The one number that we have the biggest struggle getting. So it's an interesting dichotomy. We should be able to count the visitors, which we can't count because we don't have a visitor center, and yet our budget depends on our ability to count the same visitors. It's fascinating.
I, for instance, for 2 years have bought the passport for the parks, and they've never once sent me a mailing, sent me a fundraising thing, sent me anything. And it seems to me they are sort of in the dark ages in terms of how to capitalize on donors and such.
Are you talking about the National Park Pass?
National Park Pass, yeah.
Good. I don't want to get too far into that issue, but it's an excellent issue, and it gets into two things. One is the idea of parks as businesses, and do the national parks market? And this gets back to this gentleman's question earlier. You look at the Leopold Report, and you look at the Omnibus Act of the Park Service that was passed. The idea was that the parks were being over-visited. There were too many people in a park. I personally can't conceive of too many people visiting African American Meeting House, or too many people understanding Brown versus the Board of Education. But this gets back to Wrangell St. Elias versus, Maggie Walker's home. What's too much for which park? So part of what happens is that the Park Service does not want to advertise. So National Park Foundation initiated this PASS program, which is an excellent program, by the way, because the money goes directly back to the parks, as does your entrance fees on most parks. Goes directly back to the parks as of only 4 or 5 years now, since the fee demo project was passed. In the past, you could go to the park, pay $20 to go into Yellowstone and say, I support the Park Service, and that money went straight to the federal deficit. Until 5 years ago. So it's only in the 5th year of the fee demo funding where the Park Service can keep a portion of its entrance fees. And that's where, again, where the public comes into place. If I'm visiting a national park, I want to think that my $20 should go towards a better toilet somehow, or a better picnic table, or something to help support that park so it doesn't have this maintenance backlog. But I mean, that's sort of my opinion. It's not about politics. It's about you getting the process together so it all works. There's still a bit of a struggle there.
How about one more question?
One more question. Let's try this gentleman over here. Yes.
I was just wondering if the National Park Service might be suffering an identity crisis. The original parks that people image, that they fix their image of a park on, or Yellowstone and the natural wonders that the Hudson River School painted. And then I walked the Freedom Trail today, and in the middle of skyscrapers, I'm in a Park Service unit, and it seems confusing to me. Should the Park Service divest itself and perhaps find another agency to do historic monuments and then retain the natural history, nature, landscape function?
Well, actually, remember two things. The National Park Service Organic Act very clearly states that cultural resources, Mesa Verde came into the system in 1890. So it's one of the oldest parks. A lot of the Pueblo parks in the West came in before most of the natural parks. And again, here's the problem. This is a crisis that the Park Service has as identity, is that we tend to focus on that it should be about the Yellowstones and the Yosemites, and some of us who are inside the Park Service know all the funding goes that way. But the vast majority of our units are not those, the vast majority of them. We have 57 national parks. The remaining out of that 390 are historic sites, cultural sites, sites of heavy use. And again, I don't think that's wrong. It's just a different dichotomy. And the agency does need to make that shift, because the roof for Frederick Douglass should not be leaking. It's a $5,000 job to repair it. Right? Small things, but that's where our shift in priorities needs to be, I believe. And I think that's a problem, is how we get people engaged, the next generation engaged, is to what is a park, and why is a park a park, and what does that concept mean? And to me, it means national heritage. What do we set aside? And I think it was Hillary Clinton who said that we have all these, the Save Our American Treasures program, that we have these treasures that are America that we should save. And whether you agree with the politics or not, nevertheless, I think a nation should know its heritage. It should know its historic artifacts. And we can learn from the Chinese and from the Europeans, who are very much better than we are at preserving their heritage, whatever the heritage is, or however painful it is.
Well, thank you very